In my very first job in Russia, I had to hire these diamond cutters. And I thought it was going to be easy. I sort of looked my nose down at management. I can pay them a lot more and this is going to be easy. And it turned out they wanted more than just to be paid. They wanted to have a picnic. And by the end of a bottle of vodka, I realized what they really wanted and what I could offer that the state could not offer was to give a damn. That was the moment when I was like, oh, management really matters and it's actually really interesting. How can we create situations where people can become their best selves and love each other and their work? That's what it's all about, right?
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Kim Scott knows a thing or two about modern leaders. She's coached CEOs at Dropbox, Qualtrics, and Twitter, and she led AdSense, YouTube, and DoubleClick teams at Google. She joined the faculty at Apple University and co-founded Radical Candor, which is a Silicon Valley company helping organizations create healthier cultures, build cohesive teams, and achieve collaborative results. In our conversation today, we discuss how leaders often mistakenly resort to authoritarianism, inadvertently transforming themselves into workplace jerks. Kim's expertise sheds light on how to adjust this behavior to create more effective leadership, avoid the pitfalls of being too aggressive or too nice, and create a healthier and more productive workplace. In this episode, we talk about the difference between aggressive versus radical candor, leveling power dynamics for more effective communication, and how to optimize collaboration. We also discuss just work, which includes ways to create a fairer workplace, the dangers of viewing employees as commodities, the difference between bullying, bias, and prejudice at work, and other topics. As always, if you enjoy this episode, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now I bring you Kim Scott. Kim Scott, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you so much. I'm excited for our conversation.
I'm very, very excited to talk to you today. And one reason is I knew of your work, but I wasn't very familiar with it until I did a big manager survey where I asked a whole bunch of managers, who would you recommend other managers read? And Radical Candor came right to the top of that list.
Oh, good. I'm happy to hear that.
And I will admit, I looked at it and I read the title and I said, it sounds hard. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm ready.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very nice.
I wasn't sure I was ready to read the book. Now, having read it, I really see what they were talking about. And I wish I had read it long before it was written, honestly.
So do I. I mean, I wrote the book I wish that I had read when I became a manager.
Yeah, it's super helpful and it really frames a lot of stuff. For people who haven't read it, how do you summarize it? How do you describe it when you're explaining to people what it's about?
So let's first talk about what it is, and then I'll also help explain it by talking about what it isn't. So what is radical candor? Radical candor is what happens when you care personally and you challenge directly at the same time. Sometimes people talk about it in terms of compassionate candor. Radical candor sounds harsh. Radical candor is not harsh. It's very fundamental. That's why I call it radical. And it's also rare because it turns out it's hard to care and challenge at the same time. But that's the goal. Now, let's talk for a second about what it isn't. So if you imagine a 2x2 framework, all of life's hardest problems can be boiled down to a good 2x2. So when you challenge, but you fail to show that you care, I call that obnoxious aggression, also known as the asshole quadrant. But I didn't name it that. I named it obnoxious aggression because I want people to think about this 2x2 framework as a compass to guide specific conversations with specific people to a better place. These are not a bunch of personality attributes. It's not another Myers-Briggs test because we're all obnoxiously aggressive, probably multiple times a day, unfortunately. And so the biggest problem with obnoxious aggression is obviously that it hurts other people. But there's also a more subtle problem, which is that it is a waste of breath. If you're a jerk to someone, they go into fight or flight mode, and then they literally cannot hear what you're saying. So you may as well not be talking. And it's also a problem, I think, because I don't know about you, Dart, but for me, when I realize I've acted like a jerk, it's not my instinct, in fact, to go them the right way on the care personally dimension. Instead, it's my instinct to go the wrong way on challenge directly. Oh, it's no big deal. It doesn't matter. But it is a big deal. It does matter. And then I wind up in the very worst place of all, manipulative insincerity. That's what happens when you're neither caring nor challenging. And that's where passive aggressive behavior, political behavior, all of the worst stuff creeps in. And that's where the drama in the workplace comes in. We mentioned Dilbert when we were chatting before we started. So if you read Dilbert, you're going to read about manipulative insincerity and obnoxious aggression. If you watch The Office, you're going to see a lot of episodes about those behaviors. But those are not the most common mistakes. In my experience, at least, and I'd be curious to hear what you think, the most common mistake most people make most of the time at work and at home, frankly, in all relationships, is when they do remember to show that they care personally. Most people, it turns out, despite everything you might experience on social media, most people are actually pretty nice people. So they do remember to show that they care personally, but they're so worried about not hurting someone's feelings or not offending them that they fail to say the thing that the person would be better off hearing in the long run. And that's what I call ruinous empathy. So obnoxious aggression is what happens when you challenge, but you don't care. Ruinous empathy is what happens when you care, but you don't challenge. And radical candor is what happens when you care and challenge at the same time. And I think that there's a very common sort of false dichotomy about leadership, which is that you have to choose between being ruinously empathetic and obnoxiously aggressive. And part of what I was trying to do when I wrote this book is to break free of that false construct.
Right. I'm a fan of all four. I know I can wander through them, but if I'm going to anchor on one, it's going to be ruinous empathy. And so much of my management philosophy has emerged from trying to fix things I've done badly in the past. And I wish I'd had that word just a lot earlier.
Yeah, so do I. And, this is an example of why radical candor works. That word, it took me months to come up with that phrase, ruinous empathy. And for a long time, I was calling it cruel empathy because I kind of liked the way that sounded. And my husband, who's an engineer, was like, no, not accurate. And then I was coaching Jack Dorsey, actually, for a while when he was CEO of Square. And he said, I refuse to read a book called Cruel Empathy. It sounds like a Harlequin romance. And so somewhere between feedback from my husband and Jack Dorsey, I realized I couldn't call it that. And I talked to a bunch of people before coming up with ruinous empathy.
I noticed very clearly that you were really good with adjectives. It comforts me to know that took a long time.
It took a shocking amount of time.
And one of the risks, I think, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the nature of the revisions that you put into the book and what you felt you needed to adjust, is that there's a lot of people out there who never read the book. All they do is they hear about the title. And I think the book Servant Leadership is one of those. I'm not sure that many people have cracked the spine to see what that really means. And so, are there any misunderstandings that you might like to adjust?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in fact, I published the second edition of Radical Candor because it happened all the time. I'd be working with a team and someone would charge into a conference room and they'd say, in the spirit of radical candor, and then they would proceed to act like a garden variety jerk. And that is the spirit of obnoxious aggression. That is not the spirit of radical candor. So if that is happening on your team, please call it compassionate candor. And, it's interesting. People have asked me, do you wish that you had titled the book Compassionate Candor? And there's part of me that does because this misunderstanding is so prevalent, but I don't think it would have sold as many books.
Right.
So.
I completely agree.
And then another problem, I think, with the term radical candor is that it often gets confused with Ray Dalio's radical transparency. And radical transparency is really obnoxious aggression. It's all challenged directly and very little. I'm not saying there's no care personally, but it doesn't quite jump above the bar.
I have a little bit of understanding about that. I interviewed there.
So did I, and I did not take the job.
I did not either. But here's just a weird factoid. On my interview team was James Comey.
Really? Wow. That is, I didn't even interview, actually. someone called me and I talked to a friend of mine who works there. And he said, here's the kind of thing that happens here. There's a meeting and everyone attacks someone in the meeting. This person starts to cry. The meeting is recorded and then it is sent around to the whole company as an example of what ought to happen in a meeting. And I'm like, that's not a place for me.
I got a hint of that, yeah, which is that people saying, I really didn't feel I belonged until I broke down. And yeah, it's definitely not compassionate in my understanding. In your revised book, you share the picture of a book that was on the TV show Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley, yes.
And I remember what the title was. The title was, and they were definitely referring to your book, it was The Asshole's Journey.
So that's not actually a picture.
Oh.
That is my that is my screenshot.
I see.
So what happened was they made up a version of Radical Candor. I can't even remember what they called it now. I have to look. I'll tell you in a second. But then I screenshotted their, since they were knocking off my stuff, I thought, well, fair's fair. I'll knock off their stuff. And I screenshotted it and I put in The Asshole's Journey.
That's a really funny title. I think that could be your next book.
Yeah, not The Hero's Journey, but The Asshole's Journey.
I'll tell you one of the things I am working with as I read your book. It's tricky to think about, but the recommendations made in the book are how to improve interpersonal communication. That's one of the most, fundamental things that's in there. And a part of the way I see it is that a company works better when interpersonal communications are constantly improving both sides of the conversation. So you've got all these agents inside a large, complex system, and they're not all talking to each other. They're only talking to the people right next to them. And so it's a first-person look at how to make those connections correctly.
Yes, that is really an important part of it. Another important part of it is about what to do about power, because there are few things that disrupt communication more than power. And so a lot of it is about laying power down if you have it and sort of stepping up and getting on a level playing field if you don't have it. And I think that's also a bigger part of my next book, actually, but a big part of what's in maybe it's not as much in the text, but it's a big part of the subtext of Radical Candor.
It makes a ton of sense to me, and it makes a ton of sense to me as a book that managers should read, because that is the place where managers have the most control. They have the most control on how they interact with the people around them. And I agree about the power, which is it's not top-down radical candor. It's multi-directional. It's a mesh network of clear communication about what needs to get done. And not just what needs to get done. That's not actually it, but how to improve, how we can get better together. The reason it's challenging to me is because I'm somebody who approaches problems from a systems perspective. Very sort of third person, not first person. I'm going to come at it from above. I'm going to look at the whole system. That's been my job most of my career, is looking at whole systems and figuring out how to adapt them. And as I read it, I thought, is there something this can't touch that still needs to get touched? In other words, are there parts of the system that can't be solved by improving the performance of individual actors?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think when I was writing Radical Candor, I was writing it sort of in the hopes of encouraging individual managers to voluntarily lay their power down. If you think about it from a systems point of view, I believe hierarchy is necessary to get stuff done. I do believe you need managers and directors and VPs and CEOs and all that stuff in order to help collaboration. And I do think collaboration is so, so important. But I think the more that we treat hierarchy and the different roles in hierarchy as jobs that one gets held accountable for, as opposed to like value judgments on your importance as a human being, the better those hierarchies work. And I think this was certainly in the early days of Google, this was sort of revelatory for me. Early in my career, I joined a couple of startups. They had very young CEOs who had no management training. and they were disasters. And I sort of attributed the disaster to the fact that the CEOs were assholes, as one does. So I decided, well, I'll start my own damn company, and I'm not an asshole, so everything will be great. And it was not great. Now I was the asshole, And that was a painful lesson. And then I joined Google in 2004. And look, things were not perfect in those days at Google. And I want to acknowledge that a lot of people had really terrible experiences, even in the early days. But I had a great experience early on at Google. And I got to know Shona Brown, who led business operations at Google in those days. And she had sort of created systems that intentionally stripped managers of their traditional sources of power. And so I got there, and part of the reason why I was hired is that I had a reputation for assembling great teams. And then I couldn't hire whoever I wanted. I was like, what the hell is that about?
Me too. Just about died. I just about died when I couldn't hire the specific people I thought I needed.
Yeah. And then I realized that this was done intentionally, and that actually I hired better as a result of having to go through this, that we make better decisions as part of a team than as individuals, actually, when we're open to the feedback from the other people, because very few people that I'm sure there are people who can become self-aware alone in a cave, but most people need other people holding up a mirror in order to sort of understand themselves. We can't understand ourselves in a vacuum, most of us. I always talk in absolutes, but nothing I'm going to say is an absolute. But for most people, it's useful to be part of a team, and you make better decisions as part of a team. So I think that the system, and I talk about this just a little bit in Radical Candor, and I talk about it a lot more in Just Work. But I think creating systems that force people to get on a level playing field and build real human relationships, that is really important. There's a great book that I just read called Burn It Down about Hollywood. And when you have these systems that reward bullying behavior, you're going to get really terrible behavior. And that has a terrible impact, not only on the people doing the work, but on the work output.
Some of what you just said about leveling power, it reminds me a little bit of, have you ever read Margaret Heffernan?
No.
Oh,
I'm going to write it down there.
You would really like her work.
What do I need to read?
Well, there's a TED Talk book that she did, which is called Beyond Measure. She was on the show, and we didn't talk about this, and so I didn't get a chance to float this idea. But it's really about distributed cognition, which is how do companies, if companies are a giant brain, essentially solving problems made out of a bunch of individual people passing information back and forth to each other, what are the attributes that especially leaders need to take on to free the channels of information so that they're efficient? And the term distributed cognition actually comes, I think, from Edwin Hutchins, who was a cognitive anthropologist at UCSD. And he would study, for instance, the navigation bridge of a naval ship and look exactly at how the distributed cognition was working in terms of navigation across 4 people.
Yeah. I often thought when I was building a team, I thought of each hire as like a mental prosthesis. So this person can think about these problems and own these problems in a way that I could never do. The magic of a great team is that you're like the bionic person, and it's great. It's like thrilling because all of a sudden you have all this skills. You don't have them, but you have access to them. It's like an orchestra. Not everybody can play the oboe, but when you have, if you're the violinist, there's something that is magical about that kind of collaboration. That's the human condition. That's the best of the human
It's the best.
condition.
It is totally the best. So one of the things you look at a lot in Radical Candor is you look at the behavior of top executives. And you've been lucky to work with a number of very top executives, Steve Jobs, Larry and Sergey, and a bunch of other top executives. And you often cite things that they have done. And I always get a little edgy around that. And I get edgy around it because in the same way that I wouldn't necessarily trust actors or great athletes for wisdom, I wouldn't trust executives who have risen to places of prominence because of their technical expertise, right? Technical expertise and wisdom don't necessarily go
Two
together.
different things. Yeah, totally.
But you found that they had struck upon some wisdom.
Yeah.
And I wonder a little bit about how that happened. And I think it's because something that happens in Silicon Valley that doesn't happen often other places is that founders lead companies to over 100,000 people. And the founders are still there, and they've had to do all the learning from their most naive understanding through managing a company of that size.
Yeah, I mean, I think the founders who really succeed have had to get beyond their technical expertise, and they've had to learn something about management. In fact, at Steve Jobs' memorial service, Al Gore gave a talk, and he talked about how the greatest thing that Steve created was not any product, but the company. And, Steve Jobs has a reputation for being obnoxiously aggressive, for sure, not for radical candor. But in my experience at Apple, and I think this is important to remember, I think in the context of his relationships with his team, there was real love between the folks who worked directly with him. Like Tim Cook offered to give Steve Jobs part of his liver when Steve was ill, and Steve refused the sacrifice. Like, I don't know of a word to explain that other than love between those two people. And you could see that when Steve was having lunch with Johnny Ive. They were talking in a way that people who really care about each other were talk. You could see it. And I don't think I would have liked to work for Steve Jobs because I wouldn't have appreciated that level of harshness. But there are different people who respond differently. I had, for example, I'll give you an example of me being slightly harsh, but there was a guy who worked for me and we were localizing AdSense, the product. And I had worked with this guy for years and he kept conflating Slovakia and Slovenia. And, we had a kind of relationship where eventually I said, look, it's Slovakia, not Slovenia, dumbass. And for him, that was like not a huge, it was funny. But there were a couple of new people on the team. And I realized like now all of a sudden I was this scary person to them. So then I had to go and say, look, Jared and I had that relationship. That's okay. I'm not going to talk to you that way if it will make you uncomfortable. So I think one of the things that leaders need to learn is they need to figure out who they are and they need to surround themselves with people who work well with their particular style. And they need to be, being an authentic leader doesn't mean ignoring the impact you're having on people around you. You need to be gentler with some people and more direct with other people. And like learning how to do that correctly is all part of radical candor. There's no objective measure of what's radically candid and what's not radically candid. And I think Larry learned over time how to be, Larry Page at Google learned how to be a good manager. I think he also learned he didn't love that part of the job and hence Sundar. And that takes a lot of discipline and a lot of self-knowledge and a willingness to be quite humble, not to grab the power,
Yes. In radical candor, you never say the word love.
Yes, correct. But when I give a talk, I do talk about love, and sometimes people object. Love makes some people uncomfortable.
Do you have a sense of why?
At some level, what I'm talking about with radical candor is love and truth at the same time. And when we use words that are as abstract as love and truth, we're prone to misunderstand one another because all kinds of people have all different kinds of interpretations of those words. And truth is a dangerous word because I'm going to tell you the truth. That's not usually radical candor. That's often obnoxious aggression because it's implying like I've got a pipeline to God and you don't know shit from Shinola. So words that are extremely abstract are prone to misinterpretation. And that's why I said care personally, because I felt that was a little bit more precise. as to what I meant. And also, it's only when we're lucky that we love the people who we work with. We can work well with people who we do not love.
Right. And we can be compassionate with people we do not love.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can respect people, respect in the sense of not I honor someone for their achievements, but respect in the more fundamental sense of the term. Like, it's my job to respect how you feel, who you are, that sense of the word.
I heard another good title in there, though. Love and Truth at Work. That's poppy.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to start moving on toward what I think of as your more recent work, even though I think the revision to Radical Candor might have come after it. It's your book, Just Work. What is the origin of Just Work?
Yeah. So I decided I had to write Just Work. It took me another 4 or 5 years to do it. Just after Radical Candor came out, I was at a tech company in San Francisco giving a Radical Candor talk. And the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade and is someone who I like and respect enormously and is one of too few Black women CEOs in tech or in any other sector, frankly. And she pulled me aside after I gave the talk and she said, Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that when she would offer anyone even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, she would get signed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And as soon as she said it to me, I knew this was true. And I realized that I hadn't sort of come to grips with the fact that bias, prejudice, and bullying so often taint our feedback, both our ability to hear it and our ability to give it. And, I'd put her in kind of a jam in writing Radical Candor. And frankly, I had put myself in a jam in writing Radical Candor because it was harder for me to roll out my own ideas than it was for my husband, who's a white man and an engineer. So I realized that this was something I had kind of dodged. I had been in denial. I had been in denial about the things that were happening to my colleague. I had been in denial about the things that were happening to me. And I had also been kind of in denial. I imagined as a leader, I was creating these bullshit-free zones. And I hadn't actually done that to the extent that I had intended to. And so I tried to come to grips with that in Just Work. And by the way, I would say the title Just Work just didn't work. We're going to retitle the paperback. It's going to be called Radical Respect.
Can you remind me of the subtitle? I don't have it in front of me.
Sure. The subtitle right now is How to Eliminate Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Create a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusivity. The new subtitle for Radical Respect is going to be, we're still editing it, so you can give me some feedback. But I think it's going to be put the joy back into working together, or put the joy into teamwork, or put the joy into working together. The word back is maybe problematic because I'm not sure it was ever there.
I was going to ask about the connection between these two books and how one is an extension of the other. I'd like to go deeper into that because part of what's in the back of my brain is that there's a very dominant 2x2 that's used in Radical Candor. And then there's also a very dominant 2x2 that exists in Just Work. And I haven't really done the work to fit them together, to know if they're one model. And so I think we should talk about what that model is in Just Work and then talk about the connections.
Yeah, so the 2x2 in Just Work is you want to optimize for collaboration, not coercion, on the vertical line. And then the horizontal line is you want to honor individuality. And so when you can honor each person's individuality and optimize for collaboration at the same time, then you get radical respect.
I just want to point one thing out because we're speaking in very abstract terms. And the book itself is not abstract at all.
No.
It talks about very concrete harm that happens when we move toward coercion and we move away from individuality.
Yeah, towards conformity. I don't know anybody who wants to work in this like 1984 style, everybody's marching in lockstep kind of. We all imagine that we're creating these workplaces that honor everyone's individuality. And yet the tendency to start demanding conformity is intense, even in silly ways. Like I remember shortly after I joined Google, which, as I said, is one of the best places I ever worked, I was going in to give a presentation to the founders and the CEO about the AdSense business. And somebody was like, you can't wear a pink sweater. And I'm like, why can't I wear a pink sweater? You got to pretend to be a man. I'm like, come on. And yet this person thought they were giving me good advice. And that's not the end of the world, but that's an example of a place that was celebrating individuality and yet drifting towards demanding conformity.
I think one of the important things I learned reading Just Work was that there is a slippery slope that slides through bullying, through harassment, to abuse, to physical harm. And there are a lot of stories in your book that are very specific about things that have happened to you and things that have happened to others that are so disturbing, but they start at the top of the slope.
Yeah, they start out pretty innocent. I mean, there are other things that don't start out so innocently. Like overall, I'm starting from a place of enormous privilege and yet, slid down that slope many times.
Right. And that it is a part of keeping the whole system just that we correct things at the very top of the slope, that we recognize them for what they are. And I think bullying is one of those things where bullying is often quite public. And so it's something that's actually visible. Whereas abuse and harassment, well, abuse in particular starts to be invisible. And so correcting right at the top of the slope and adjusting that so that we can keep the system moving toward justice.
Yeah. And I think that bullying is something that we often accept that we don't have to accept. And I think it starts in school. I think we all can think about the quote unquote popular kid in middle school who was just a complete jerk. Why was that considered popular? Like, why does it work? And I think it's maybe not quite Lord of the Flies. Lord of the Flies slid all the way down the slope, but we just allow it. And teachers allow it, parents allow it. My daughter was getting bullied at one point. And so I was saying, say to surely this child doesn't realize how much they're upsetting you. Say to this child, I feel sad when you, and my daughter banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? And I'm like, damn, that's right. But we do that all the time. I mean, I can remember getting feedback training where this person who I really like was teaching us to do this. And I'm like, sometimes the intent is not good. And so you don't want to bring that person closer. You want to push them away if you're the target of the bullying. And if you're the leader in that situation, it is your job to create consequences for that bullying. And you got to create conversational consequences in the moment. You got to shut it down. You've got to create compensation consequences. Like, don't give high ratings and bonuses to people who indulge in bullying. It should be disqualifying. And you got to create career consequences. Definitely don't promote a person who engages in bullying. There comes a moment, I think, when the assholes begin to win. And that's the moment when the culture begins to lose. And at some point, you've got to fire people who are bullying others, even if they're getting great results. And that's really difficult to do as leaders. And leaders are too often unwilling to take on the bullies who work for them. And that's hard. That creates a terrible culture. And yet it happens over and over to the point that there's, at Atlassian, they had an explicit rule, no brilliant jerks. No amount of brilliance makes up for acting like a jerk. And that became part of their performance reviews.
Yeah. One person I had on the show was Darius Mashazadeh, and he wrote a book called The Core Value Equation. And it's essentially it had a lot of interesting chapters, but it was that those values need to be written down. They need to be created by leadership. They need to be well thought out. They need to be usable, which is that everybody needs to be able to read them and understand them, and that they need to be applied. And a part of that is that if you have a high producer who is running counter to your values, it's going to be hard, but they need to leave.
Yes. In the immortal words of Steve Jobs, it's better to have a hole than an asshole.
Huh.
But
coming from him,
and given his reputation, yes. But there's some wisdom to that.
It's really catchy, though. I'll remember it.
Yeah, it is very catchy. And it probably takes a certain amount of that behavior to say something like that. But I think it's really important to have that discipline as a leader, because the thing about acting like a jerk is that it often works for the jerk, but it's bad for the whole team. And therefore, it's your job as a leader not to allow what's good for one person to hurt everybody. And very often leaders do the exact opposite. They reward the jerk because it looks like the jerks are getting better results than others. But the only reason they're getting better results than others is that they're tripping others up. And you got to decide, do you want that jerk or do you want to have a team? And if you only want the jerk, then you can let them continue. But if you want a team, you've got to get rid of the jerk.
What did you learn writing Just Work?
My gosh, writing Just Work was like a 5-year intensive therapy session for me. I think the most important thing that I learned was, and the hardest thing for me to come to grips with, I mean, it was a little bit hard to get out of denial about the things that had happened to me as a woman in tech. You know, I sort of went through a bunch of my career pretending like a whole bunch of things were not happening that were in fact happening. So that was a little hard, was coming to grips with my role as the person who was harmed. Much harder was coming to grips with my role as the person who caused harm. And there's a bunch of chapters for people who cause harm. And writing those chapters in a way that extends compassion to people who cause harm without meaning to, or who, Bob Sutton wrote The No Asshole Rule, and he talks about people who are bona fide assholes and temporary assholes. And we are all temporary jerks from time to time. So I think coming to grips with that and figuring out what would have to happen so that I would stop causing harm sooner was the thing that I struggled, I think, the most with in that book. And I think the other thing that I learned is that I thought I was finished with that book when it was published, obviously. And I realized after I started a podcast and started reading sections that I wasn't finished. So actually, the paperback is going to be a lot shorter and I think punchier, because giving someone or hearing feedback that you have spinach in your teeth is one thing. But giving someone feedback or hearing feedback that you've done something that runs counter to your idea of what is ethical or moral is way harder. And yet we have to have a growth mindset about morality as well as dental hygiene,
Yeah, you told a story of being a bystander. The thing about being a bystander to harm, I think especially when you're young,
A silent bystander.
a silent bystander, right?
Not an upstander.
Right, not an upstander, is that you look back and you realize that you knew, but it didn't quite rise to the level of consciousness. I don't know if that's the way you experience that. It's like you knew.
Totally, 100%. It's like knowing what Freud calls knowing without knowing.
It's only when you look back that you say, I should have done something and I did not do something.
Yeah.
You told the story of in Russia with the ballet troupe. Can you describe that a little bit?
My first job out of college, and this resonates very differently now than it did before Putin invaded Ukraine. But my first job out of college was working for what was called the Soviet Companies Fund. So this was in 1991. And we were partnering with the Soviet military industrial complex to convert from military production to civilian productions, trying to reap what was then called the peace dividend. And my boss at the time loved to tell this story about going to the Bolshoi Ballet with one of our partners at the time. And for those of you who are not familiar, like the Bolshoi Ballet is one of the top ballet troupes in the whole world. I mean, they're incredibly talented, beautiful, passionate artists. And at the end of it, the partner leaned over to my boss and said, "Do you like ballerinas?" And, my boss sort of was taken, he said, "Of course." And he said, "Which ballerina?" And as though he was going to deliver any of the ballerinas from this ballet to his hotel room that night. And my boss dealt with it by turning it into a funny story. And he sort of let himself off the hook morally by saying, "Of course I would never do such a thing." But none of us came to grips with the fact that we were partnering with someone who was engaging in human trafficking, you know? And I didn't laugh because I was so horrified, but nor did I challenge the situation. It was like one of those moments that we just sort of brushed under the rug. And that comes back to me all the time. Like, why would I not have said, "This is not okay"? Why did my boss not say this is not okay? Why did none of the other, there were 3 other people on the team listening, laughing along with him. Why did none of those guys say, "I don't want to work with someone who thinks that's okay"? Why do we say nothing? And I think this is the question of our time. That there's a great article in the Times about Harvey Weinstein, about everybody knew. Why did nobody say anything? I'm sure some people did say something before it came out, but why do we allow this kind of behavior to persist?
Some people did say something, and the system could not respond. There's still a dead space.
Yeah. And still is, by the way. This is the book I mentioned earlier, Burn It Down, is sort of about how the system works in Hollywood, or fails to work, how the system reflects and reinforces that kind of hideous bullying behavior that crosses a line into harassment and physical violence.
I want to tell a story about being corrected, about somebody who intervened when I was doing something wrong. Wasn't bullying, but it was biased. We were in a project team meeting, and it was maybe 10 people, and we were trying to figure out our resources. And there was a woman returning from mat leave. And I said in the meeting, we should prepare for her to be at half speed for a few months. And a woman in the room said, "Wait a second," jumped in right away and said, "That is not the right thing to say." Now, the men in the room said, "That's not what Dart meant. He meant that she was going to ramp back up and she was going to go through that program." And I said, "That is not what I meant. I really appreciate being caught in that." And I was so appreciative of the woman who spoke up and caught me doing that. Now, I know where that came from. That came from me taking care of twins while my wife went back to work. And I know that I couldn't run a business. So I was like reaching back. I was being compassionate, I thought.
You were reading yourself into her story.
I was reading myself. And the situation was quite different too, because lots of reasons. But I think it's a story that I tell because there are people who are cautious about speaking up because of how it will be received. And at least in some cases, it is highly appreciated.
Yeah. And so my guess is that you had done a bunch of things before she spoke up to prove to her that it's never going to be comfortable, but that you wouldn't punish her for speaking up. I'm guessing.
There's certainly lots of cases where that's been the case with my own team. My own team is incredibly good at telling me whatever they want and whatever they feel is important. And you spoke a little bit about different cultures where somebody from a different culture from my team would come on and be offended by how directly the team members told me that I was making a mistake. I mean, usually it was an intellectual mistake. It wasn't something like that. Although sometimes absolutely it was. Absolutely. In this particular case, the person who spoke up was not in my chain of command, and I was not a threat, I don't think, to her.
But you had a reputation more broadly for being open
Let's
to feedback,
hope.
I'm guessing.
Yeah, let's hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that story because that's the way it ought to happen all the time. When the person says the thing that is problematic, they don't want to say or do the thing that's problematic. They want the correction so that they can learn and do better. And they won't punish the person for telling them. In fact, they'll reward them for telling. And yet that's so rarely what happens. And I think part of it is the systems problem that we've been talking about, power. Another part of it, I think, in those moments is that we so often conflate bias, prejudice, and bullying as though they're the same thing. And I think if there's a hard problem, it's useful to break it down into smaller parts and address each one separately. And in this case, it was bias. And it is much easier to address bias than it is prejudice or bullying. So in this case, she said the thing, and it became very obvious from your response that it was bias, that it was not a prejudice. But I'll tell you a different story shortly after I came back to work after having twins. So I feel that like that's an intense thing. But I was chit-chatting with a guy right before a meeting, and he said, "Oh, well, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children." And again, I thought this was bias. I didn't think he meant that as an absolute thing, but, And so I made a joke and I said, "Oh, well, I decided to show up at work today because I would like to neglect my children, you know." And I expected him to laugh and we would move, he would apologize and we would move on. But no, he said, "Oh, no, Kim, this is not a joke. Like, it's really not good that you're working." And so now all of a sudden it's not bias. Now I know it's prejudice. And so if it's bias, I think, and it's maybe worth pausing at this moment to define these things, because bias I define as not meaning it. Prejudice is meaning it. He meant what he was saying. And bullying is being mean. He was not trying to be mean to me. He thought he was doing me a favor to tell me this, me and my family, but he was not. And so how do you respond? If you respond to bias with an I statement, what this woman did in your case, "I don't think you meant that the way it sounded, Dart." And you were right. You didn't mean it if you stopped to think about it. But these other guys were saying, "Oh, he didn't mean it at all." So it's important to recognize when you're recognizing bias to say, that is the implication of what I was saying, but that is not what I actually believe. Whereas with prejudice, it is going to be the thing that the person believes. And so there you want an it statement. And an it statement kind of draws the line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want. He could believe that if he wanted to. I didn't want to take the time to have that conversation with him, but he couldn't impose that belief on me. So the it statement in this case was, it is my choice together with my partner how we raise our children, just as it is your choice together with your partner how you raise your children. And moreover, in order to give some teeth to my it statement, I said, and it is an HR violation for you to tell me I'm neglecting my children by showing up at work. And that, had the intended impact of getting him to back off. But then I had to reassure him, I'm not going to make a thing of this with HR, but I don't want you to impose your attitudes about raising kids on me. That it's not your job to tell me how to raise my kids.
And you were so quick on your feet, which is routinely, that's what I should have said.
And I'm probably telling the story better than I actually responded. But if you think about bias, prejudice, and bullying, if you think it's bias, start with the word I. If you think it's prejudice, start with the word it. And if you think it's bullying, start with the word you. So an I statement invites someone in to understand things from your perspective. An it statement kind of draws a line, don't step over this. And a you statement pushes someone back. And to me, that's been very helpful. And sometimes you don't know whether it's bias, prejudice, and bullying. But if you're aware of what you're assuming, it can be helpful to point in a direction of a particular response.
There's a dimension. It's not on your 2x2, but it's one that I want to explore, which is the dimension of thingness, which is that there's a range of how we think about other people. One is as a whole human. And then very casually, we can get into the habit of thinking of people as things. And we spoke a little bit before the show about the words that we use to talk about employees and people in the workforce and how objectifying they can be. One of the people I'm going to have on the show later is somebody who studied slavery in Rome. And I don't mean by any means to equate the brutality of slavery with some of the discomforts of work. That's a completely different animal. However, it shares in common certain attributes of objectification. Is that buried in your model? Like, is it in there?
Yes, I hope so. I hope part of respecting a person's individuality is sort of moving towards having an I-thou relationship, what Martin Buber calls an I-thou relationship instead of an I-it relationship with this person. And an I-it relationship might objectify the person and start treating them as a thing, or it might start treating them as a partial human. So I think one of the things that often happens at work is you care about the person as an employee, but not as a whole person. And that's a problem. I think in order to create the conditions for radical respect, you have to respect the whole person, not just the part of the person that's doing the work.
And when you look back on the ballet dancers in Russia, they had been turned into commodities. So very much things, not partial things, but things. And so it's definitely running parallel to that story. Can we talk about your LLM, the Kim Scott LLM? When I was preparing for this, Alex Komorowski, who has been on the show, we had a great conversation on the show, told me that he and a couple of others, Gordon Brander and Dmitry Glazkov, had whipped up an LLM, a Kim Scott LLM.
Yes. Well, we're calling it the Radical Candor LLM.
The Radical Candor LLM. What's it like chatting with your own...
with myself.
Yeah, with yourself.
Part of what I talked to them about doing this a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, before it was really possible. I said, look, in my role as coach, what I often do is I will talk to someone about some management challenge they're having, and we'll have a great conversation, and then we'll hang up, and I'll go back to the book, and I'll copy paste the section in the book that pertains to this thing that they're struggling with, and I'll email it to them. And they're like, "Oh my gosh, you wrote that so fast." I'm like, "Well, I copy pasted it." And so I feel a little bit sheepish, like I'm a highly paid router. This feels like, when I was at Google, I was doing customer support work, and you had this knowledge base. And a big part of what we were doing is sort of automating questions and answers, the Q&A. And that turns out to be a better experience for people than waiting around on hold for a long time. Better and less expensive. So I said, can't we do this? Can't we turn Radical Candor and Just Work into knowledge bases? And when people ask questions, they get an answer. And then ChatGPT came along, and I said, let's flip it on its head. Let's not act like the exciting thing about this technology is that it writes for you. But the exciting thing about this technology right now is that it can correctly interpret a question and match a bunch of content with the question. And, it was pretty good. I would say we have more work to do on it. It tended towards ruinous empathy. And it didn't do as good. Like what I really, in an ideal world, what I wanted to do is to grab the text from the book and give it the text I feel like I spent a bunch of time writing the book. I wrote it in Google Docs. There were 100 and some odd collaborators. I hired some great editors. Like every word in that book has been examined, re-examined. And so I think the book is better than anything that AI can write. But I do think like this matching the question to the answer and get me out of the, like, I don't mind if it gets good enough that it can replace me as a coach in a lot of cases. I mean, there are some things that are just too abstract for even a giant language model to understand. Like, someone will call me and they think they have a communication problem and that people are misinterpreting them as obnoxiously aggressive. And really, when I talk to them, the problem is that they actually think they're better and like, there's an arrogance problem, not a communication problem. I don't, I, you know, it would be a pretty smart large language model to figure that one out. So I think there's some stuff that I can figure out that the large language model couldn't figure out. But I think for the large majority of questions, it could point someone to the right place in the book.
Right. If their query contains the thing they don't know, in other words, it's the wrong query, it's not going to work for them. Right?
Yeah. I mean, it could be that we could train it to work, that we could ask some follow-up
Yeah,
questions
maybe.
that would say, actually, your problem is. So I'm not a Luddite. I think it could get there, but I don't think it's there yet.
There's a few questions I ask at the end of every show, and I want to get onto those, my closing questions. One of them is, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
As a writer, my job helps me think. It helps me think more deeply. It helps me get others to challenge my thinking. If my job now is writing, what my job does for me is to help me get both inside my own head and back out. That's what my job helps me to do.
It's very interesting. And I always use the word job, but the truth is, it may not be a job, but it's work that you do. What's interesting about that is that one of the things you most value at work from your work is one of the things that you championed in Radical Candor, which is let's help each other think more deeply and more completely. Let's challenge each other. You described what you want from work, and you described exactly what Radical Candor is promoting at work.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's why I wrote the book, I think. Another interesting way into that question is Viola Davis wrote a memoir, and it is such a wonderful explanation of how work can help us sort of recover from trauma and can help us become more whole people. And I think that in the end, that's why work really matters. And even if it's not like recovering from capital T trauma, work helps us become more whole people when work is going well. And when work is going badly, it alienates us from ourselves, to borrow thinking from someone else. I was rereading recently Anna Karenina, and Tolstoy, is always thinking about work and life and what it all means. And Levin is struggling to manage his estate. And he thinks like the answer is like and it's like, the answer here is management. Levin is a terrible manager. He doesn't know how to manage the people on his estate. Management really matters when you think about it in those terms. And it's really very interesting when you think about it in those terms. I mean, in my very first job in Russia, I had studied Russian literature and I had to hire these diamond cutters. And I thought it was going to be easy. I sort of looked my nose down at management and capital. I was like, oh, all that's involved is paying them. And I can pay them a lot more. And this is going to be easy. And it turned out they wanted more than just to be paid. They wanted to have a picnic. I'm like, okay, well, I can pay and I can do a picnic. And by the end of a bottle of vodka, I realized what they really wanted and what I could offer that the state could not offer, that the system that they were operating in could not offer. What I could offer was to give a damn, to care enough about them. And as you can imagine, I'm thinking a lot about these people right now, to get them out of their country if things went sideways there. And that was the moment when I was like, oh, management really matters and it's actually really interesting. It's the same reason why I'm interested in fiction, why I love writing novels and reading novels, is that how can we create situations where people can become their best selves and love each other and their work? That's what it's all about, right?
There's a book to be written there, by the way. You could write this book, which is essentially management in literature.
Yeah, yeah.
Lear was very bad at setting up systems of management, and the play ensues,
Yeah, yes, exactly.
I have to ask, did you read Anna Karenina in Russian?
I read it in English. I have read bits of it in Russian, but Russian, I don't know. I never really mastered Russian well enough to read such a big book in Russian.
One of the things that somebody asked me at work when I said that I was going to be interviewing you, when you set out to write just work, did you feel there was a gap in the existing literature, in the existing writing? Because what's interesting about it is there's two ways to look at it. One is there's a gap in the existing writing, and the other one is I'm on a path to really understand this thing. And then I can share that understanding.
I think it was more me being on a path to understanding. And I read many, many, many wonderful books. Virginia Woolf talked about encouraging young writers. And she said, if I'm a writer, why do I want so many other people to write? And she said, because I love to read. And so I think the way that I write about injustice in the workplace and how to make a more fair and reasonable workplace will resonate with some and not with others. And that's sort of my contribution. I think we all need to wrestle with this topic. I mean, I think this is the job of our generation. Between Me Too and Black Lives Matter, we're coming out of this knowing, not knowing moment, I think, especially as a white person, I was in denial. And also as a woman. So I'm like, as a white woman, you're sort of both the person harmed and the person causing harm often at the same time. And so coming out of that knowing, not knowing, it's a little bit like the moment when Oedipus realized he murdered his father and married his mother. Like there's some pretty difficult topics that we're coming to grips with. And my hope is that by being willing to investigate my own experiences, I could help myself and maybe some other people be willing to understand and acknowledge and notice what we've done and what's been done to us rather than gouging our eyes out. And I think a lot of this book banning business is sort of the equivalent of we're going to gouge our eyes out rather than come to grips with this. We're going to need to fight hard to not retreat back into the knowing, not knowing, or even more blatant denial. And so that's why it felt important to me to wrestle with my own experiences, not because I had a better way to look at it. There's enormous literature on these topics and many, many, many great books. And I think this is not the work of one person. This is the work of many people.
Where can people learn more about your work?
RadicalCandor.com and JustWorkTogether.com are the best places. Twitter is dying a painful death, so I'm more often on LinkedIn than Twitter these days in terms of social media. And frankly, I hope both Twitter and Facebook disappear, or Meta, whatever you want to call it. I hope they just disappear and we figure out a better way to deal with bullying in social media because it's a big problem. And I think LinkedIn does a reasonable job.
It does. Yeah, I think it does a good job. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. Great conversation, and hope it'll be the first of many.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.